Once upon a time, there was a tiny wheat grain. Now, this wee little thing wasn't all that thrilled about its life as a grain of wheat. I mean, what is there to be thrilled about? It was just a tiny grain of wheat, after all. And so, as the farmer carefully placed this tiny grain of wheat into the furrow of his field, it felt cold and alone. And it didn't even know if growing into a wheat stalk was really worth all the effort. It thought about how one day it might be chopped down and turned into something else, something that would eventually be eaten by some animal or maybe even some human. And it thought, why should I make that sacrifice for? Why should I work hard and grow into something great only to be chopped down and forgotten? And so, as the other grains were excitedly chatting about how they couldn't wait to grow up and be the best wheat stalks in the field, this tiny grain just stayed quiet. And then, as the sun shone down and the rain fell from the sky, the other grains started to sprout and grow. But not this tiny grain. It just sat there as the days went by, stubbornly refusing to grow. "Oh, well," thought the other grains, "that's a shame. That tiny grain has chosen not to grow, and so now it will never get to fulfill its purpose." Then one day, as the wind blew through the field, it carried with it the sound of a human voice. And the tiny grain listened as the farmer walked past and said to himself, "Next year I won't plant any wheat. I don't think the wheat is worth the effort. I'm going to plant sunflowers instead." And the tiny grain heard this and suddenly got very worried. You see, all its life, the tiny grain had heard stories about how wonderful it would be to be harvested and used by the farmer. It had heard how happy humans would be when they ate bread made from wheat flour, and it longed to be a part of that. And now it was afraid that if it didn't grow and prove itself to the farmer, then the farmer would decide to plant sunflowers instead of wheat next year, which meant that the tiny grain might never get the chance to fulfill its destiny. So, realizing that it needed to do something fast, the tiny grain summoned every bit of strength it had and started to grow. At first, it grew very slowly, and the other plants in the field started to mock it. "Hey, slowpoke," they would say, "you're so tiny and weak. We all started at the same time, and now we're almost done growing, but you're still so small. Why bother trying?" But the tiny grain just kept growing, and though it was true that it was weaker than the others, it had something they didn't have. See, the tiny grain had been through a lot, and all that time it had spent sitting in the dark, being cold and lonely, had given it lots of time to think. And during all that time, it had come to realize something important. It realized that no matter how difficult things are, it's always possible to improve your situation if you're willing to try. So, with this newfound determination, the tiny grain continued to grow and get stronger each day. And finally, after many weeks, the tiny grain grew into a plant just like all the others. In fact, it grew into a strong and beautiful wheat stalk that had a full head of ripe wheat. And the tiny grain was so happy. It was happy because even though it had been weak and doubted itself, it had managed to grow and become something great. And it knew that all the other grains in the field felt the same way. They too were happy that they had grown into strong and healthy plants. Then, one day, the farmer came back to the field to harvest the wheat. And as he cut down the stalks, the tiny grain thought to itself, "This is it. This is why I grew. This is what I was made for." Then, after the farmer had collected all the wheat, he took it to be ground into flour. And as the big metal wheels of the grinding machine crushed the wheat, the tiny grain thought, "I may be getting smaller, but I'm helping to make something much bigger than myself. I'm making flour that will be used to make bread, and I'll be a part of that bread, and I'll get to make children happy." And then after the flour had been gathered up and put into sacks, it was loaded onto the farmer's truck and taken to the local bakery. And as the truck rumbled along the road, the tiny grain could hear the sounds of children laughing and playing. And it thought, "That's me, I'm making those children happy, and that's what I was made for." When the sacks of flour arrived at the bakery, they were unloaded and taken inside. And there, the baker began to mix the flour with water, yeast, and salt to make dough. Then, after the dough had rested and risen, the baker began to roll it out into thin sheets and then roll up those sheets into long loaves. Finally, the loaves were placed in baskets and put into the oven where they baked until they were golden-hued and smelled absolutely delicious. Then, when the bread was done baking, it was put out to cool, and the baker sliced off a big chunk and took a bite. "Mmm," he said with a satisfied smile. "This is some good bread." Then, not long after that, the bread was placed in paper bags and taken out to the farmer's market, where people came from all around to buy the freshly baked bread. And the tiny grain could see all these happy families buying the bread and taking it home to eat. And the tiny grain thought to itself, "This is it. This is why I grew. This is what I was made for. I was made to make children happy." Then, one day, a young girl came to the market with her mother, and as they walked past the bakery, the girl stopped in her tracks and said, "Mommy, can we get that bread, please? Please, please, please." And the mother smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart, let's go get that bread." And as the girl ran to get the bread, she turned to her mother and said, "I want to be just like that bread when I grow up. I want to make children happy." And the mother hugged her daughter and said, "You know what, honey? I think you already are making children happy, and I think that's wonderful." And that's the story of the tiny grain of wheat that refused to grow. It's a story about believing in yourself and never giving up. You see, the tiny grain of wheat was a small and insignificant thing, just like you and me. But despite that, it had a big dream. A dream to make children happy. And it worked hard to achieve that dream. It didn't let the fact that it was small and weak stop it from trying. And as a result, it grew into something great. And that's a lesson that we can all learn from. No matter how small and insignificant we may feel, we can still accomplish great things if we're willing to try. And so, my little friends, never give up on your dreams. And always remember that you are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think.